book shortly. If you want to know a bit more about our churches, you'll find us online at www.pbc-ebc.org.uk. You can contact us using the information on the website or send us a message via our Facebook page. Next Sunday, at Providence Baptist Church, we'll be live streaming a service from Westbury Lee Community Hall, which will be available on our Facebook page for you to watch at home. And then our sister church, Ebenezer, will be having their carol service live streaming at 4:30, again on our Facebook page for you to watch. So hello, good evening everyone, and a special good evening and welcome to Phil Heaps. Could you please tell us a little about yourself, Phil?
Okay, I guess in order of importance, I'm a Christian, I'm a husband to Ruth, I'm a dad, I've got 4 children in various states of grown-upness. I used to live about 10 miles north of Bristol in Yate, but we've just moved to Islington at the end of last summer, or this summer past. And I work for an anti-terrorist organisation, winning hearts and minds. It's called Highbury Baptist Church.
Okay, very good, very interesting. So what is it that inspired you then to write your book, Who Stole Christmas?
Well, really, it was a friend of mine who said, Phil, you need to write a book, and I'll sort it all out. But it was something I was passionate about, sharing something about the truth of the Christian faith in ways that connect with people. It was an idea that I'd used at a carol service a number of years ago, and so it very much led itself to be turned into a book and then widely distributed.
Okay, this question might well lead to some spoilers, but who was it that stole Christmas? Was it the Grinch?
Well, it wasn't Dr. Seuss's book, or at least he tried. And some people say it's COVID this year, but in my book, it's neither of those. So, I mean, it would be a spoiler, wouldn't it? But when I look out at our culture and the extravagance of people's celebration, except perhaps this year, I get the feeling that we almost celebrate for the sake of celebrating. To prove that we're having a good time, to get into the festive spirit, because that's what everyone else does. And yet deep down, we feel an emptiness. The emperor has no clothes, and that's pretty chilly at this time of year. And so I'm trying to show that we've lost what Christmas really is about, amidst all the other things that are sort of touted and emphasized and done.
Okay, if not the Grinch, what is your favorite Christmas movie then?
My favourite Christmas movie? I don't really go for Christmas movies, I don't think. I mean, the classic movies I see at Christmas time, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think, I guess I would have a favourite. Yeah.
Okay. And the Jim Carrey's version of the Grinch, I think it's highly annoying, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
So you make this thing. Sorry?
I was saying Jim Carrey in the Truman Show, that often gets rolled out at Christmas time, and you know that's a classic. So okay. I prefer him in Truman to Grinch by a mile.
So you make a distinction in your book between Dr. Seuss's fictional story and the gospel accounts of Jesus's birth. But isn't the so-called Christmas story just full of myths and legends?
Well, I guess some versions are. The whole cast of animals, the innkeeper and the like, they're sort of parts for the school play, but they're not part of the original. And I guess what I do is I'd encourage people to read one or both of the 2 original accounts of Christmas, in Mark's Gospel, in Luke's Gospel. And then I'd ask them to come back and to say which bits they thought were legendary or mythical, and we take it from there. It's a very sort of throwaway comment. But I much prefer to work with some, you know, you tell me which bit it is, and if they say, well, you know, I don't think the kings were called that, I would say, well, no, neither do I. I don't think there were 3 kings, but it was King David, King Herod, and King Jesus.
Okay. But Melchior, Balthazar, and Caspar, or whatever they were called.
That's all sort of late imagination. So I would make that distinction by comparing with the original accounts written in the 1st century.
Okay, so you want to strip away the legends of the 3 kings, so-called. They were wise men and wise men and shepherds all turning up at the same time.
Yeah, it makes a great postcard, but you know, there's no evidence that all the evidence is the other way around.
Okay. So who was this Dr. Luke? You especially quote at length from Luke's account of Jesus' birth. So who was this man, Dr. Luke? The gospel, of course, in the New Testament bears his name. And what evidence do we have that he was a trustworthy historian?
Okay, so the gospel that we call Luke's gospel doesn't have a name attached to it. It doesn't open with his name, and so it takes a bit of detective work to find out who wrote it. It's part of a 2-volume work on the early church, Jesus and the early church, and with a little care we can see actually that he's part of the story. He's one of the people who's recorded there. And it turns out that the author was one of the first generation of Christians. He was a traveller, he was a doctor. He spent significant and the subsequent events. And lots of archaeologists and historians are impressed with the quality of Luke's history. In fact, if it wasn't for the supernatural bits, then no one would have any problems with him as a first-rate historian, the way he writes, the things he references. But the uncomfortable fact about the story of Jesus is that you can't get rid of the supernatural bits. And so really the only way to be convinced of the truthfulness and the accuracy of Luke's writing and the New Testament, which it's part of, is to read it. I often say that to people. We can compare and trade evidences and archaeology and resources, I might find some evidence and someone else might say, well, I can find something on the internet which undermines that, and I could say, well, you can find some answer to that. But there's nothing like reading the thing itself, and that is the way to be convinced of its truthfulness. Greater influence on the history of the human race than any other figure. And I'd say that any self-respecting human being should have read at least one of his authorized biographies, especially since it only takes a couple of evenings. The Gospels are really very short. Lots of people have opinions, but it's good to start with the data. So I would say you don't need it to be proved first before you read. Start by reading and see what you think.
Okay, so Luke in the introductory paragraph to his Gospel says that he had access to the eyewitnesses to the key events of Jesus's birth and life. So how did he come to speak to these original actors in the story?
Well, he was connected with one of the most influential of the early Christians, a man who started as a great enemy of Christianity, Saul of Tarsus, and then encountered the risen Jesus post his resurrection, and was completely transformed. It's a story which changed really the course of history. And Luke was very closely associated with Paul, and Paul had access to connections with all of the disciples later on, and it seems very likely that Luke would have had conversations with Mary, Jesus's mother, and that would be where he would have got much of his information. That seems a fairly clear inference to draw. There are things that he tells us that only she would have known. Jesus' father seems having passed away earlier in his life.
Okay, yes, in the Acts of the Apostles, he suddenly inserts himself into the story, doesn't he? And rather than saying they did this and they did that, it's we did this and we did that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. At moments in his second volume, in his Acts, he's very much a player. That's right. He's traveling around. And so he's there. He's in Israel, Palestine. He's able to meet these people and talk to them, and there for considerable periods of time. And you can tell by his writing that he has a sort of a journalist's nose to dig things out, and he gets things right. Geography, the names of Roman officials, wherever we can check him out, he gets things right. He's got that concern for accuracy, and that's a great reassurance.
How does Luke portray those early followers of the Lord Jesus, especially as they're described in the gospel account, as they're following Jesus, as they're seeking to understand his teaching and follow them? Does he portray them in a wholly positive light?
Oh no, and I think this is one of the striking things about all of the Gospels, and indeed through the Bible. They say, don't they, that history is written by the victors, and yet the descriptions of the early followers of Jesus are very much warts and all, descriptions which they themselves would have provided to Luke. And that was one of the striking things about the whole Jesus movement, was that those, some people say, well, it was all a sort of deceit foisted on the world, and yet the character and the caliber of those who really spoke about their own failings and shortcomings in a most unflattering way very much undermines that view.
Okay, so their doubts, their misunderstandings, their personal failings that the followers of Jesus forsook him when he was under arrest. It's all there, isn't it? Warts and all, as you say.
It's all in Technicolor. Yeah, it's all there. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So then, well, why do we celebrate the birth of Jesus on the 25th of December?
Okay, so that was just a convenient date, presumably some sort of pre-existing festival. In fact, the idea of celebrating, commemorating Jesus's birth isn't a biblical idea. Christians commemorate his resurrection. They do that every Sunday, or what we call the Lord's Day. But the whole Christmas thing came much later, though it is a very wholesome focus if we're thinking about what it means for him to be born. But the 25th of December was just a convenient date to time with a festival that was already there.
And you talk about who stole Christmas. When the Puritans dominated Parliament in the 1640s, didn't they steal Christmas by banning it?
Well, I'm not a 17th century historian, guy, so I think that's probably a bit of a detour. I think I'm gonna stick with Luke and the things I know about. But
very good.
I guess, like all of these things, what Christmas had perhaps become was such a long way from what Christmas was, and maybe they felt that particularly keenly. Yes, that's not my knowledge set. I'll leave the Puritans back in the 1640s for now.
So you say that Christmas without Jesus is like Christmas dinner with no turkey, no roasties, just sprouts and bread pudding. So why doesn't a Christless Christmas satisfy?
Well, there's something about being a human being. We want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We want to be part of something that matters, and we've seen that this year very much so, haven't we, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then before that with the whole Save the Planet sort of eco thing. And we sense that there's more than just the mundane. And yet, what our society tells us is that what matters is just being ourselves, and we have to invent meaning. And of course, if we've invented it, we know it's invented. We know it's made up. And so there's this disconnect that we want to believe that there's something that matters, and yet we've embraced this worldview as a culture which says that everything came from nowhere by accident, which says that there's no absolute truth, there's no basis for right and wrong except our personal preferences, there's no ultimate significance in anything, because in the end all the ripples disappear. So we want to worship something as human beings, and yet we find everything is too small, because only God is big enough. And I think that Christmas is all about God in the end, something that God did, something that God became, something that God is. There's something awesome about Christmas, and whatever else might be wholesome or enjoyable about the Christmas that we tend to celebrate in our culture, there isn't anything awesome, there isn't anything that connects to our deep-seated sense and knowledge that there's more. And yet the true Christmas story takes us right to the heart of what that is. So I think we sort of, it's almost a denial of what we are as human beings. It's a superficiality to leave that out.
So what does it say about us then as human beings if Christmas is the best the world has to offer? The family get-togethers, turkey with the trimmings, presents, the best telly that the broadcasters can put on, allegedly. So why doesn't that satisfy us? Why doesn't that fill us to the brim? What is it about the human soul that whatever material riches we may possess, albeit fleetingly on the 25th of December, that still leaves us feeling unsatisfied?
Well, it is because we're made in God's image. We're made to know God. We've got this capacity to relate to Him. The great worldview of the Christian faith is that at the heart of everything is a person, and that's why, as human beings, people are so important to us. We imagine that's why this Christmas is so upsetting for so many people, isn't it? Because they can't connect. They can watch the same telly. They can have the same presents delivered by their DPD driver, but they're missing people, and that's because people are what matters. And as Christians know that that's the case, because at the heart of reality is a person, a great person, a person who knows and loves and speaks and communicates, and we are made to know Him. And therefore, if we're made to know Him, then anything short of that is going to leave us empty. It's going to leave us. A great African thinker once said that our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. It's as if there's a God-shaped void in us, at the center of us, which can only be filled by that. And so I think that the things that maybe we try and fill it with, they may be good things, but they rattle around. They're not big enough.
So what makes Jesus then so special that his birth long ago, 2000 years ago, roughly 2020 years ago or so, is still being celebrated 2 millennia later?
Well, that's a great question. It is all about who Jesus was. I was seeing some sort of billboards as I was driving through London the other day. Christmas is kindness, Christmas is this and Christmas is that. But Christmas is Jesus. And so the big question is, who was he? And the great claim of the Christian faith is that in the person of Jesus, God himself has invaded our world, that he has, without ceasing to be what he always was, has become one of us. He's taken a human nature to himself, God the Son. And so Jesus is one of us. He's like us. He's born into our world. And yet that wasn't the start of his story. That wasn't the beginning. But in fact, there is another side to him, another aspect to him. Growing a person, as it were, in his humanity as he grows, there is behind that a great divinity. So it's a remarkable claim. But if it's true, then we see why suddenly this is the event that divides history. You know, we still look back and we say, don't we, 2020 what? Well, 2020, 20 years since they estimated Jesus was born. They were off by about 5 or 6 years, but it still divided history in two. Now, if that was just a great teacher, that was just a moral, insightful leader, you know, why the reverberations? Isn't it? It's the great mystery that it's like Sherlock Holmes used to say, sort of fictionally, when you've eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And it's this challenge to say, who is Jesus? Who is he? Is he who he claimed to be? Is he who his followers claimed him to be? Is he the one who, what was it that changed their lives and left that crater in the first century? We see a crater, we know there's been a meteor. There's a huge crater. A whole religion changes direction. A whole movement begins, which ultimately, within 300 years, saturates the whole Roman Empire. And we've got to say, where did that start? What gave the impetus for that? And if someone says, well, it was just a few clever guys writing a couple of books, you'd say, well, that's your story, but it's not convincing.
I think it would be true to say, and historians are bringing that to the fore increasingly, Tom Holland and his work Dominion, that many of our most cherished Western values are rooted in the Christian faith. That the dignity, true dignity of each and every individual human being, whatever their skin color, however old they are, from womb to tomb. For example, the idea of people having rights, the right to being treated with respect, the importance of love, and these values that are at the center of our society and have been for many hundreds of years, are rooted in the Christian story. And without them, the world would be a very different place.
Absolutely, yeah. Tom Holland's book is a very interesting book. I was reading or listening to an audio version the other day, and just that how different the ancient world is in terms of some of the things that we just take for granted. We say, well, of course, people are valuable. Of course, they're valuable, and yet it was, why should that be? The fittest have survived. The story underneath our culture's view of life doesn't support any of these things that we aspire to. Quite the opposite. The story which supports our aspirations to care and kindness and dignity is the story that we're just trying to get rid of as a society. It's the branch that we're soaring, and I think in many ways society is not a nicer place as a result of the things that we're getting rid of.
Yes, I mean, in the Christian faith, there's the belief that God himself became man in Jesus Christ, and a lowly man was born among us, laid in a manger, went about as a traveling preacher, washed his disciples' feet, and then laid down his life upon a cross. And the idea of Jesus dying on the cross can be sentimentalized, can't it, in our society? But to be crucified was reserved for the lowest of the low in the Roman order. So that he died that lowly, despised death. And you have a chapter in your book, The Shocking Why of Christmas, in which you say that Jesus came into the world to save us from sin and God's judgment. But isn't that kind of language a bit harsh? Surely most people try and live decent lives. All we need is a good example to show us the way.
Okay, well, I guess people say that, don't they? And they say, why wouldn't the world be a nicer place if we were all nice to one another? We have to live in the real world. There's sometimes an irony, I think, that Christians are accused of a sort of fairy tale thinking. But actually, the Bible is very honest. I mean, Guy, imagine we lived in a world where no one had ever told a lie. How would we feel about the first lie? We would be absolutely devastated. It would feel like the foundations of everything were breaking up. You'd start to think, who could I trust? Up until now, I'd thought that someone said something and it was true and it was reliable. But now, of course, we just take it for granted. We live in a world full of dishonesty. We just don't have a perspective on what decent is. Our picture is so distorted. We're so used to these sort of things that we're just not in a position to step back and to say, this is how things are, and we're doing pretty well, and be as if we were able to tell God what's right and wrong, or what's good and bad. I think there's a sort of temptation. There's a danger of great arrogance in it. We who can see so little, telling God, who can see everything, that we think actually we're good enough and we're all right. I think if the world was what it should be, then I think even one thing, and it's like, isn't it? If you I went running the other morning, and I wore some old jeans that were spattered with mud, and I sort of came back, and there were doubtless a few more spots on them, but I wouldn't have known one way or the other. But if I'd have gone out in some brand new, clean, perfectly maybe white trousers and then come back, it would be perfectly obvious. And we're living in a mud-spattered world, saying that, do you know what I mean? We think it's pretty clean, and we just need to wipe away a few of the bits. And I just think that's unrealistic.
So we were talking earlier how the Christian faith affirms the true dignity and value of all human beings, and so undercuts racism and sexism and many of the other isms that sadly dog our society. But at the same time, the Christian faith makes us face up to the fact that we are sinners. We are living in a broken world. And that self-understanding is very healthy, because I'm a sinner, you're sinners, you're a sinner. I can't look down upon you from the grand heights of lofty perfection. I must own my own weakness and brokenness. And yet in our society is a tendency to think that if we've liked the right thing on Facebook, we can signal our virtue and then demand those who differ from us are cancelled and annihilated, and not allowed to give voice to their views. So there's this moral relativism where it's just what's right or wrong in my own eyes. But if someone steps out of line and defies my PC view of things, then they're landed on like a ton of bricks.
I used to have a ruler on my desk which was all notched all the way along, and it was an utter nightmare for drawing straight lines. You know, you can measure things just about, but it was one that hadn't sort of gone back to school days, and there was, you know, if you could probably get a 3 or 4 centimeters of straight line before there was the notch, and we're like that. Who are we to tell God what's a straight line? Yeah. I mean, the idea that people are basically good, except the ones who aren't. We're like a glass of water on a train table. You know, when things are going smoothly, everything's okay. But when life starts getting a bit bumpy, what's inside tends to spill out. And often that shows what we really like, particularly our words in our society. And so we ask ourselves, you know, on a good day, when everything's going my way, I'm a really nice person. Do you know what I mean? But that's not a good measure, is it?
No.
When people are crossing me, when I'm not getting my own way, when things are going wrong, how do I cope with that? How do I respond to that? Do I respond in a way which shows that I value each and every person as a human being? Do I respond in a way which is grateful for every good thing that I still enjoy from God? And the answer is no. So we tend to be tough on others and soft on ourselves, that might make us feel good, but it's not the honest way.
But in Jesus, you were saying that he is fully God and one of us. In Jesus, we have a perfect human being who was without sin. How could that be then?
Well, I guess in one sense, how could it be? It's more the question of was it? Looking at his life, and it's Jesus is an uncomfortable figure in as much as that. When we imagine a perfect human being, often we have a sort of view of niceness. Jesus there was something tremendously attractive about him, welcoming. Children love to be with him. When he needed an illustration involving children, they always seem to be at hand. People who were rejected and outsiders seemed very much at home with him. And yet he had very tough things to say to those who thought that they were better than others. So that there's a truthfulness about Jesus which is uncomfortable. There's a quality and a caliber of his life when we see the way in which he gave himself for others. And lived his life for others. There's something which is attractive, and yet we feel a bit uncomfortable about it. And we like to say, "Oh yes, but that was him, and I'm me." And yet, as I say, it's one thing to talk about; it's another thing to read it. I would encourage your listeners to go looking and say, "Who was this man who lived like this?" You might find it's very different than you expect. Both words that are well known and striking, and then interesting and difficult things as well. But that's the reality is, or the challenge is, as we read, he was able to challenge his opponents and say, which of you can, find fault with me? And since they were desperate to do that, it was a very striking thing that no one had an answer to him in that situation. And yet it wasn't a sort of holier than thou. It wasn't a sort of a self-absorbed self-righteousness. There's a great almost self-forgetfulness about Jesus. Someone once said that Jesus never met an unimportant person, which was a lovely statement, that sense in which for him, each person, he gave them his time and his attention and truth and love. A most remarkable character. But again, reading is believing, I guess.
His opponents called him a friend of tax collectors and sinners, meaning that as a heavy criticism rather than a compliment that he had the human touch. Yes. And so in the central claim of the Christian faith is that in Jesus, God became man. He is Emmanuel, God with us as one of us. And then Jesus, as the Son of God, died that death upon the cross. And according to the teaching of Jesus himself and the teaching of the New Testament more generally, Jesus' death upon the cross atoned for the sins of the world once and for all. How could the death of one man deal with the terrible weight of human evil over the centuries?
So, I mean, I guess, again, we tend to start with a how question. And my instinct will be to go to the is it true question. Has it happened? If this is the case, if I've got a headache and I don't need to know how the paracetamol works for it to fix me. But we know that. So I guess it's hard to use an illustration, perhaps. How could something, a single man's death, something clearly comes from the fact of who he was. I guess if you went outside, if you go outside on a clear day and you look as far as you can see, how far can you see? You say, well, 25 miles, 30 miles. Well, of course, the answer is 90 million miles, because you can see the sun. And you can see the sun because it's so great. And the death of Christ, when the man who was God, the man who combined in himself humanity and deity, when he laid down that life, when he took responsibility for all of the wrong things that his people had done, when he took that responsibility, that was an awe-inspiring thing. That was an incredible thing. God isn't trapped in time, and so in a sense the impact of Christ's death in the place of the guilty was like a stone in a pool that goes both ways. But how could it have been? It is that combination of who Jesus was as God's Son, and then the moment that this was the time what everything was leading up to. And that's the great thing about Christmas. So many people, their view of the Christmas story is that it's, it starts with the angel and it finishes with the shepherds and the kings and doing a picture postcard. But really it's like watching 5 minutes of a 3-hour film and thinking you've understood it. It's a climax of everything that had gone before. The human race was knocked off course by its first pair, the first man, the first woman, and their choice to go their own way, their choice to know better than God, had a huge impact on all of their descendants, all of their offspring. And in the same way, Jesus's willingness to take all of that was wrong and all the guilt and pay for it, and then rise again, has this tremendous effect on all of his offspring, but now not physically but spiritually. And so we know how one thing can lead to a great it's just got to be the right thing at the right time, isn't it? And that's what it was with Jesus's death in God's plan.
Okay. And Jesus's suffering and death was something his followers couldn't get their heads around until at the resurrection Jesus explained what had happened. that was necessary for him to suffer and die. And you say this was something that God had been leading up to over the centuries. And in the Old Testament scriptures, there are remarkable prophecies of Jesus's suffering upon the cross and his resurrection glory that followed on from that. I mean, could you recommend one or two key Old Testament prophecies that describe Jesus's death in graphic detail, as if the prophets who spoke hundreds of years before Christ was born were there eyewitnesses of those events?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say the first thing to do is to read the account of Jesus's death in one of the Gospels. So Matthew or Luke, those are the Gospels with the Christmas story at the beginning. If you read the account at the end of them, you will get two very different perspectives on the event of the crucifixion, and yet together a sort of 3D picture of what was happening. But then there are two more perspectives in particular that you can bring in from the Old Testament. One is Psalm 22. So many of us are familiar with Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. It's often read at funerals. But the psalm before that, Psalm 22, is really a view of the cross from inside. It's almost remarkable. It's what did Jesus feel like? How did it feel to be Jesus there? So Psalm 22 is a great place. As I say, read the account in Matthew or Luke, or preferably both. Only a few minutes to read those two accounts. Then read Psalm 22. And then Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah chapter 53 is really the perspective of the cross. Again, in part from the bystanders, but in particular, God's view of it. It describes a character called the servant. It begins just before chapter 53 of Isaiah, chapter 52 and verse 13, I think it is. And when you read the Psalms, or the Psalm 22, and when you read Isaiah 53, the thing to do is to remind yourself this was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. No one disputes that. No one disagrees with that. That is, these were part of the Jewish scriptures. And then to say, how is it that there is such an insight, there is such a remarkable description of these things? But even those things in themselves are the power of to see the power of the way in which the Old Testament leads into the New Testament is the project of really reading the Old Testament. And so I can enthuse about it, and say it's incredible, it's amazing. But the only way to see it is to dip in. Do you mean? Genesis is a great place to start with the first half of the book of Exodus, and we see descriptions of what was going to happen. But if you wanted two places to go, I would say Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, and then perhaps Isaiah 9 will describe the birth of one who was both a child and yet, in some remarkable sense, God. And I just don't know what the Jewish readers would make of that, but I know what I make of it with hindsight. It's a very striking Christmas reading in Isaiah chapter 9.
Yes, I think some people, when they've been shown Isaiah 53 for the first time, and they're not told whether it was from the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, or the New Testament, they assume that it was from the New Testament, perhaps an episode in the Gospels, whereas in reality those things were written 700 years before the birth of Christ, that he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and so on. In your book, you say to your readers, but you mustn't stop at the child in the manger. You have to go right up to see the man on the cross dying in the place of the guilty. And you have to stand, as it were, before his empty tomb, knowing that he conquered death. But again, how can we be sure that he did conquer death? What historical evidence is there for the empty tomb? Especially with what's going on at the moment, with UK COVID deaths amounted to over 60,000. Sadly, death doesn't seem to be very conquered, does it?
No, and it doesn't, does it? I mean, and that really should be a solitary halt on our pride. I don't know. Do you know what the death rate was 200 years ago? It was 100%. Do you know what I mean? Everyone died. And the death rate today is 100%, 1 in 1, which is, why we should be so interested in someone who bucked the trend. What is the evidence for it? The evidence for it is, there's great evidence for it. But I guess in a sense, it's that cumulative evidence. It's that sense of what makes sense of the birth and the emergence of Christianity, its truth claims. There are huge things, that the tomb was empty. No one denies that the tomb was empty. Jesus was seen. No one denies that Jesus was, that there were claims of Jesus being seen. How do those two things fit together? The transformation of someone like Paul. But again, all of those things, I would say, it's very easy to come to a sort of claims and counterclaims, my evidence and your evidence. And I think people sometimes, again, are very tempted to say, well, I could find an answer. I'll just Google it and I'll find some contra evidence. And I would say that's laziness. I would say read the Gospels. Read the Gospels, come to your own conclusions. I would always come back on this. It's very easy to have secondhand views, and even just to think, I don't even need to look into it because I know I can find what I want to find. And that's, I think, but the challenge is actually, just go to the sources. I think people sometimes feel surprised at how short they are. Do you know what I mean? You can read a gospel in the same times as you watch a blockbuster. Go read with an open mind. Matthew or Luke or John. John was written particularly so that you might be convinced that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And then maybe read the story of the early church. In a sense, I would say each person owes it to themselves to at least have found out and discovered. And I think that's what God ultimately uses. Or go to a church, go to hear it explained. But it doesn't have to be on our territory. You can have a gospel in your home, a Bible. That's what changes people more, I think, than lists of evidence one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't got a Bible at home, have a look at BibleGateway.com. And many Bible translations there. The English Standard Version, the UK edition, that's a very good translation, as are many others too. And you can read the Bible online there, as well as getting perhaps a hard copy if you wish. So in Dr. Seuss's The Grinch, even the Grinch comes to love Christmas, realizing that there's more to it than just presents and food. His shrunken heart grows. How can our hearts be changed?
You have to meet Jesus.
Right.
You have to meet Jesus. It happens as you encounter the Jesus of the Gospel. So you read the Bible and you find that he's not just a character in a story. You find that he's not even just a person in history, but that the person, you encounter him as you read with an open mind and open heart. And that is how our hearts change. I guess it's as simple as that, and yet it's as there's no shortcut to encountering the Jesus of the Gospels. You meet him, and he changes you. It's not something you can do. God has to do it, but you can put yourself in a place where shrunken hearts get changed, and that place is, as it were, in encounter with Jesus.
So has that happened to you then? Have you encountered Jesus for yourself, and what effect did that have upon your life?
Yes, yeah. So I was a young teenager. I was taken along to church with no real interest in being there, but I went. I was in a church-going family, and I was very two-faced. I went to a rough school. I wanted to fit in there, and so there were these two worlds: the world of home, the world of school. The great goal was to never let those things meet and collide, because I was very different people in those different places. And God showed me through the example of others and in different ways. He'd shone the spotlight on my heart, on my life, and he showed me I was so bothered about what people thought about me. I was so concerned about that. I was so cowardly, and God really threw that into relief on one occasion, I think in particular, where I remember a situation where a number of people stood up for what they believed, and I thought to myself, I could never do that. And I thought how pathetic that is, how feeble that is. It's something that I might believe, but I'd be ashamed of showing it because I'm so bothered what people thought. And it was at that point that evening that I prayed to God, a great prayer of faith. I said to God, if you're there, make me different. That was it. I understood about the cross. I understood about, I knew the Christian faith, but I didn't know Jesus. And I prayed to God, if you're there, make me different. That was 32 years ago now, and God changed me. And I can look back and I can say, I have changed. God was there. I have changed. I'm still probably too bothered about what people think of me. And yet so many things have changed. And then, so that was how it happened. But another key moment was going to university. When you go to university, you test out your worldview. You find out whether it's yours, or when you leave home, it may not be university, you're going into a new situation. Do I just believe it because my parents do? And when I went to university and when I saw my Christian faith made so much sense of the way people behaved around me, made sense of the good things I saw and the bad things, it's again looking again into the evidence for the scriptures, but also deepening in my own walk with God, my relationship with him. All of those things, as it were, firmed up a path that I'd chosen as a teenager. And so those were two key moments that God used. And so if you can muster that faith to ask God if he's there to reveal himself, to make you different, if you think you don't need to change, then I think there's very little chance that you will change. You could perhaps ask a spouse or a child or a friend, and they might have a different view. But if you do need to change, if you realize that you're not what you should be, then God is able to do that.
Jesus to you is not simply an historical figure from the pages of the New Testament, but a living personal presence in your life.
Absolutely. So each and every day I start the day by reading from the scriptures to hear his word, and then spending time with him. I go out walking. We've moved to London now, and I thought it was a concrete jungle, but there's all sorts of green spaces. I've got a little place where I go, I walk, I talk to Jesus, to God, and yeah, that's how the day begins. I've got lots of special people in my life, but I would lose any of them rather than Jesus.
So how can we ensure, we think about Christmas, who saw Christmas, but how can we ensure that Christ is central, not just at Christmas time, but for the whole of our lives?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess it's one thing at a time, isn't it? It starts by checking out his claims, asking your questions, reading a gospel. But like I've said, once you C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia stories, I don't know if some of your listeners will have come across them, in his Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he was describing how he wrote it, and he sort of gave the impression he wasn't quite sure where it was going until he met the central character. The central character somehow came into the book, and it brought the other 7 stories with him. And it's in a sense, once you've encountered Jesus, then it won't be difficult. There's no way that you can meet the Jesus of Christmas and say, that's great, let's be reacquainted again in 52 weeks. It just doesn't work like that. It's like, meeting the love of your life and saying, we've had a great meal together. Do you know what I mean? I'll see you this time next March. It doesn't work like that when you meet a person. And so to ensure that Christ is central for life and not just for Christmas is just discovering him at Christmas time. What better time to do that? And when you do, there won't be any difficulty.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this conversation. If you want to know more about the Christian faith, do drop us a message via the contacts on our website or via our Facebook page if you want someone to read the New Testament claims alongside you to discuss what the Bible says about the Lord Jesus Christ. Do get in touch. I mentioned earlier our service is coming up that you can join online through our Facebook page, and further details of what we're doing service-wise can be found on our website too, www.pbc-ebc.org.uk. So we wish everyone a very happy and Christ-centered Christmas. Bye-bye for now. Thank you very much, Phil.
Thanks, Guy.
So